So tonight is, like I said, it's the final night for looking at this, lesson 32. And just as a reminder, this final, that we've been going through a series looking at the Genesis story from Adam to Noah. And in this last section, he's really taking a look at just sort of a stepping back in the big picture and saying, well, what do we make of this story? What is God saying here, and how should we be interpreting it and understanding it? And so you just sort of step back, broad view of it. They really could have done this at the beginning almost, this section. But just as a refresher and as a way to lead into what he's talking about tonight, it's about a 20-minute video or so. So you should have a little time for going over things. But in this section, the previous 2 weeks or 2 sessions that we had, I guess we weren't here last week, but he started off in session 30, just talking about how biblical authors, the writers of this story and the Hebrew Bible, how they're trying to convey the truth. And what it's so hard, you think about, it's really amazing that we have this story at all passed down over thousands of years, but hundreds of years, many, many centuries. But just think about, we've been studying Mere Christianity in the teen class, and Mere Christianity was written by C.S. Lewis back in the 1940s. It's just a series of broadcasts. But he's writing it during the World War II in England, and it's meant to be read over the radio. That's why he read it. But the language, just 80 years ago, is already much different back then than it is now. It's somewhat hard to go back and read that, and some things are very confusing just because in 80 years, our way of communicating has changed so much. Now just think about putting that all the way back to the creation story and how things have changed and how understanding of the world and views of the world and the ways of communicating have changed. And of course, it's being written in an entirely different language and now translated into our modern English. There's a very lot of opportunity for misunderstanding about that and coming at it at a wrong way. And I think that's what he's trying to go about. And so it takes some in-depth understanding. And what he focused on is that this is really a creative literature that is being, in the way style that it's written and the truth that's being conveyed, it's being done through a creative literature. And the one person he relies on, John Walton, has described it as imagistic. I guess imagistic is really what imagery. Because the ancients at this time, when this story was written down, they thought differently. They perceived the world. Just think how much the world has changed in different ways. They had different categories of thinking and priorities than we do. And the big thing that he conveys, and I think this is absolutely true, is that in our modern culture, we think scientifically. You may not think you're a scientist. I wouldn't call myself a scientist. But I certainly think about things in a scientific way. I really think about things in a lawyer way at this point. But it's very close to the scientific way. And really what that means is what you're thinking about when you think about a story or some event, or you're reading a news story or anything like that, you're thinking about causation. What came first? What did that cause next? How are they related? Is there in fact a cause and effect relationship there? How are things composed? If you're looking at a whole group of things, how are they working together and relating to one another? And what is the absolute real truth there that's being conveyed? Did this really happen? And in the ancient world, of course, our modern idea of science and everything like that had not come about. They thought about things much differently. much differently. Whereas we're primarily interested in events and material reality, they are more interested in ideas. What is the idea behind the story? What idea is being conveyed by the story? And then how can that be represented, or how is that idea being represented? Rather than a scientific, historical, in absolute terms that we think of. So this is how he describes it. They convey and use imagery, symbolism, and imagination to convey the reality of the world. It's in what he terms the world imagistically. I'd have to go back and really understand how he pronounces that word, but imagistically, through images. And this is, going over this, but this, I think really, this example he used, I don't know if y'all remember this, but this is a good example in images of what we're talking about. So the one image on the left is the image from a Hubble telescope, and that is a picture of the night sky. We're using extremely powerful telescope and instruments, and they're also doing a lot of adding things to it. I mean, it's coming to the Earth as data, so they're reformulating it and everything like that, and putting color in there to convey different points of data. But anyway, that is a scientific picture of deep space, right? Of the one on the left. That is how we approach things. So the left is how modern, if somebody asks you, show me an image of the night sky, as a modern scientific person, we would focus on the left. That's probably what we would think about first anyway. Now, y'all know what the one on the right is? Who that is? That's Van Gogh, Starry Night, very famous painting. And it too is a picture of the night sky. Now, it looks much different than the one on the left. The image of the night sky, would you say that is a false representation of the night sky? The one on the right, the Van Gogh, that is not true? I wouldn't say that that's a lie or untrue. It's a different way of communicating how the night sky appeared. It's conveying maybe different ideas and representations. I'm not much of an artist or an art historian, so I couldn't tell you exactly what makes that such a great painting and what truth or ideas he's being conveyed there. But I do get a sense of, this is how he perceived the night sky in a much different way. But neither one of those are false. They're conveying the same reality in different ways. I thought that was a really great illustration of what we're talking about when we go and approach what's in Genesis. And we think about this creation story, and we try to approach it strictly from the left side view of things and interpret it that way, forgetting about how maybe the ancient writers who wrote this story down, inspired by God, conveying a truth conveyed to them by God, are conveying it in a much different way. And that maybe we sometimes might get caught up in trying to find the left side when we ought to be thinking about it on the right side.
One thing it took me several years to notice in Starry Nights is that the center of that painting is a church.
Yeah.
And there is significance to that.
Yeah. And the lights, the way the shadows are playing, but the light's also a part of the landscape there. Yeah. It's a beautiful painting. I also think, too, I thought about this in the past. He didn't have this example, but I think it's useful. When I was I'll think back to my life. When I was a small child, I think I must have been 5, 6, just an early memory. I'd never been to the ocean. I had, grew up in the neighborhood, and probably the biggest body of water that I was aware of was a swimming pool that I went to, right? And I had a little creek behind my house, so I kind of knew about moving water and things like that. But as a young child, I had no idea what the ocean was about. Well, we took a trip to the beach. So we were going to go to the ocean. First time I'd ever seen the ocean. And my mom, I remember us driving down there, down to Myrtle Beach, and my mom was trying to, I kept asking her, what is the ocean? What does it look like? And she kept describing it. You know, it's a big body of water. You can't see the end of it. There are these waves that are taller than we are sometimes. And, you know, and I kept saying, well, where does it end? What's the end of the ocean? And where does they kept talking about the beach and the sand. I was like, well, where does the sand? And she's like, well, it doesn't really end. So my mom was struggling to convey that, and I was having a hard time understanding it, simply because I had no idea. And she could say it's like this or like that, but to convey that, it just was just beyond my knowledge. I think that happens sometimes too with these writers who are being inspired by God to convey this creation story, but they're having to put it in terms and try and describe things that are really very hard, beyond our understanding. Someday we'll have a clearer understanding, but at this point we're like I was when I was 5 years old, driving down to Myrtle Beach, trying to think of what the ocean was like. So I think that's part of it as well. It's one thing we struggle with when we look at this story. So he talks about this imagistic language. That's the way they're trying to convey this idea in a much different way than we typically do as modern people. And so in this final lesson, he's moving on now, and he's going to talk about 4 different ways people have approached the historicity, or the historical truth of Adam and Eve. So he's going to be going through this in this video, and I'll give you a preview about it. And as we talk about these different views, think about where you fall, which one seems most persuasive to you. Maybe one or more. There might be more than one. And where do you think Tim falls? He does a very good job of not endorsing one over the other. He's not trying to be doctrinal about it and convey one. I think I know which one he favors. He probably leans to. See if you can think that, and see which one you agree with. But just to kind of give you a preview of what that is, he makes a point at the very beginning to talk about this is not these different approaches. All 4 of these approaches, the people who embrace these approaches believe that the creation story is truth, is a divinely inspired, true story. So even though you may disagree about one of the ways to interpret it, these different views, or the way you see that, you may disagree with that understanding or approach, they all have that fundamental belief in that they believe that this story comes from God and is conveying a true creation story. So keep that in mind. And a second point he wants to make at the very beginning, I think this is important to say, is that although in the past several centuries, Western Christianity, particularly Protestant churches, have embraced one of these views and held it as an orthodox view, it's never been something that has necessarily been a point of contention for salvation or for understanding Jesus. In other words, whichever view you fall on, it's not something that over the centuries has been something that the church would see as condemning you to hell one way or the other, that you have the wrong view on this, therefore you're going to hell, or you don't believe in Jesus. So these are just different approaches, a different understanding of the story. The first version or the first understanding concerning the historicity of Adam and Eve, the historical nature of Adam and Eve, is called the literary symbolic view. So this is an idea that Adam and Eve are purely literary figures in a divinely inspired story. So this creation story and Adam and Eve are really a parable. In other words, like a parable that Jesus would tell. That's conveying a truth, that's representative of truth. And in fact, they're symbols. Adam and Eve are symbols of like the patriarchs, of the nation of Israel, of you, of me. We all have connection to Adam and Eve. And they are a parable that we can see ourselves in. That's the literary. So that if you were to go in a time machine and go back as far as you can in time, back to Adam and Eve, you would not, this view would say, you would not find Adam and Eve. They're not literal people like you and me. It's a parable that God has inspired the writers to convey because Adam and Eve are going, that theme that's been conveyed in that story is repeated over and over in all of us for all time. It's a prelude. I'll mix those two words up. Prologue to the redemption story. That is one view. It's not saying that this is a myth or mythological, because it is conveying a truth, but it's a symbolic literary. It's conveyed in a symbolic literary truth. Okay, that's one way. The other approach, the second approach, is on the other end of the spectrum, which is called, he calls it the first ancestor approach. So that Adam and Eve are two actual people, that they were created by God, from the clay and from Adam's rib. Eve was created from Adam's rib, literally. They had no parents. They weren't descended from anybody. They were created by God in precisely the way the text describes. And so they don't have any previous ancestors, human ancestors. And they are also the first ancestors of the rest of humanity. Okay, and that approach, that idea concerning Adam and Eve is the dominant view in Western Christianity for, at least in recent times. And the approach that most of us are most familiar with. So that if you were to go back in time, in the time machine, far back far enough, you would find Adam and Eve in a literal Garden of Eden. They were two people that looked like you and me. And if you went back far enough, you would see God actually form Adam from the dirt, and you would see Eve form from his rib. And there would be a literal tree in the garden, a little fruit that they were eating, and that they were driven out of that garden. That is the first ancestor approach. Also, with that understanding is the idea that this conveys an important reality and lessons to be learned from that approach. The third approach is what he calls the archetypal view, and it kind of goes in the middle. It's somewhere in the middle. It's that Adam and Eve were indeed the first biological ancestors of all humans, so they were the first humans, and humanity is descended from them. So it shares that with the first ancestor form. But that they're also archetypes and representatives of a story, of a reality, of a historical reality. And they are representative of all humans. And it also recognizes, this approach also recognizes that there's a certain style and imagery that goes along with this story that's unique to the ancient Hebrew culture. Not unique, but to that ancient time. Talking about this imagistic approach. So some sense of what's real, it's important that for this is that these are the first biological ancestors of all human beings. And you'll hear him talk some about the fact that this approach, what makes this approach so appealing is for people like St. Augustine or others who believed in original sin. And that Adam and Eve, through their sin, it's been descended, that sin has been conveyed biologically throughout all the generations to us, so that when you were born, a little baby, that innocent little baby right there has Adam's sin and carries that with her. That's part of that view. What's that? I've upset her. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So I know some of us are like, what are you talking about? That baby doesn't have any sin. But that's part of that narrative or approach. There's a fourth one that's very close to that actually goes more towards the literary side of it, but it's very similar. It's also called an archetypal representative. It says that Adam and Eve are real archetypal representatives of humanity, but they're not necessarily the first biological ancestors. So Adam and Eve are real people. They weren't necessarily the first humans, but they are real. The narrative conveys a real history through this medium of Hebrew literature, and that they were real people, and that the sin that's described is real. It does not necessarily conclude that the sin descended down to all of us. So each of these views are paying attention or highlighting certain things or emphasizing certain things. What we don't want to do, he makes this point, is that what we don't want to do is get so concerned about these different views and which one is right and which one is wrong, that we get lost in that and forget about the truth that's behind the story and what is it telling us about God. What is God revealing to us through this story about Him and our relationship to Him? That's the important thing. That's the most important thing. What does this tell us about God? That's what it's all about. And so we can get caught up in all of that and pick it apart to death and lose the forest for the trees, if you will. So think about that as we go through this video. I think, we'll talk about it, but there's some good comments there at the end as well from some of the students. I thought they made some interesting comments. But let's go ahead and play that, if we can, Jacob. And then we might have just a few minutes to talk.
And get out your verb charts. And, so that's kind of how this feels. To go from here to say, and so here are the views. But there is something helpful to say, this whole set of things that we just talked about, people feel very passionately about their very different perspectives. And so, but there are differences in perspectives, and they usually come down to pre-issues that come down to like philosophy and your sense of reality. And that's actually where the real differences are, but they surface as if they are just issues of biblical interpretation. In fact, they're almost always issues about just a fundamentally different view of reality. And so you get this cornucopia of views. There's a couple of helpful books that at least I'll reference and that have been helpful to me in kind of summarizing and understanding the views. One, Zondervan, a Christian publisher, has a whole series of books called 3 Views on This, 4 Views on That, 3 views. They're really great places to start learning about debated issues in Christianity. So they have 4 views on the historical Adam. They also have 4 views on creation and evolution and so on. It's a very helpful way. Everybody writes a first essay, and then each person responds to all the other essays, and then that person gets to respond to the response. So you feel like you spent a long afternoon, maybe too long of an afternoon. The other one is interesting. Is a scholar of early Christian biblical interpretation, Peter Bouteneff. And what it is, it's an introduction to how Christian scholars read and interpreted the early chapters of Genesis in the first centuries of the church. And what I walked away from this, realizing from the first decades and centuries, there has never been consensus on the meaning of, especially when it comes to historicity issues. There's a reason why in the most widespread consensus creed of the Christian belief system, it begins with, I believe in one God, the Father, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus, his son, right? Born of the Virgin Mary. Adam and Eve, these issues have not historically ever been. It's much later that traditions begin to write in historicity things about Adam and Eve. And so that's just really worth paying attention to say this is a very important conversation, but does it have grounds to divide the body of the Messiah? That's something all of us should think deeply about. It's been very helpful for me.
It's a great book. I actually just read it.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, it was really helpful.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, really helpful.
Yeah.
So here we go. Here are the views. And I'm going to paint them on as if they were like a spectrum. So you have some followers of Jesus who believe the Bible is God's word. And this is the view. It would be the literary symbolic view. They see all of the ways that the Eden narrative foreshadows, word plays, hyperlinks, patterns, all forward to the story of Abraham and Joseph and Israel. And because the characters are named human and living one, they see that it functions as like a parable prologue. That every human you'll meet in the story, this is what you're going to see. And every human who's reading this story, this is you. That's in essence what the view is. Not that everybody in this list agrees with each other. And so I think after our experience, you can't deny that that is one key function of these stories, is that it's a prologue that anticipates everything that's going to happen. On the other end of the spectrum, I would call it the first ancestor view, because that's essentially kind of the implication of this view. And it's essentially that if I were standing there, wherever there is, what I would see happen is precisely what is narrated in the image sequence that the wording is described. So Adam and Eve are 2 people created de novo, is a term people have, without any hominid predecessors, out of the clay, and then out of the rib or out of the side. And the chronology, the sequence, there you go. So that's a very common view. It has been common. It's become more common as the item of orthodox belief in the last few hundred years, especially in the West. Something, not that you can just say this, and here's the mediating view, but it is a view that kind of finds itself in the middle, would be what you could call the archetypal view, namely that Adam and Eve are representative characters. So they are human in life. Whatever, their names, it comes even in a sequence of history where the Semitic languages don't even exist yet. Shem, Shem is not even in the story right yet. And Shem is the father of the Semitic family of languages. So even what their names are not what their names would have been, because Hebrew didn't exist as a language yet. Are you with me? Even on this view. So this is an archetypal literary representation. But in this view, because the sense of what is real is tied with what really happened, it's important that Adam and Eve are the first ancestors of the human race, so that they, as Adam, the first Adam, correspond to the second Adam, the real historical Jesus. And that's the value there. If there is a real Jesus, the last Adam, there is a real first Adam. And then there's differing views on the age of the earth, old earth, young earth, every variety you can imagine. Right? But that's kind of one, really it's the first ancestor view. And the ancestor thing really comes down to your concept of the transmission of sin. This is an age-old debate. So if the solution is a human, who's the last Adam, who dies for the sins of the world, then what you of necessity need is that everybody whose sins are forgiven comes from or stems from that first sin. And it's a biological thing. And this whole thing about original sin, this is not a class on original sin, by the way. It's a class on the Eden narratives. But this original sin, this has been such a huge topic in church history. And there's one North African bishop, Augustine of Hippo, who's had a disproportionate influence on the history of the theology of the church, based on his interpretation of one verse in Paul's letter to the Romans in particular. And it seems crazy, but that's actually the case. And so he believed that sin, the sin nature, is a biological reality that's passed on through the human lineage. This is why it was also his view that he unpacks this massive work, The City of... He wrote a lot. How these guys had time to do all this, I don't know. But for example, he believed in the damnation of unbaptized infants because they are born of the line of the curse. And so if you're not baptized, there you go. But that's the logical implication of this first ancestor view. It was not a widespread view necessarily in his day, but he made it the view, especially in the West. I think in the East, that view's never been adopted.
Augustine's not generally influential at all, because he didn't speak Greek.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah,
And that's actually why his ideas often diverge, because he's one of the earliest church writers, influencers that doesn't speak any Greek. So where I think a lot of the early ones, you read the Boutneff book, that you'll see how they'll build on each other's ideas.
Yeah.
But he's the first person that can't read any Greek.
Yeah.
So he can't really build on other people's ideas that were all the people before him in Greek.
Sure.
So he kind of, and he also had a very crazy life before that. So
Yeah,
that I think influenced often how he wrote things.
Yeah.
But in general, he's a saint in the Eastern tradition, but generally his ideas are not almost at all influential in the East.
Yeah, whereas they've been enormously influential, both in Catholic and then in Protestant, Calvinist traditions especially. So this first ancestor thing is the issue for a lot of people. So what's been interesting is a kind of a companion to the archetypal view, and it's represented by John Walton falls into this camp, but it's an older view than that. Derek Kidner, an older scholar from earliest 20th century, that Adam and Eve are real, what we would call historical people. They really were appointed as the priestly representatives of image of God humanity, but they are not necessarily the first or the biologically first human species. And that goes all the way back. Do you remember these things about Adam formed out of Eden, mortal, put into the priestly garden, the temple garden? Cain is exiled. He leaves Eden, and well, there's a young woman there to marry, and he's afraid that someone's going to kill him, and he can build a city. It's like once we leave Eden, we're like in the middle of a human story that's just going, and the narrative doesn't even try to hide it. It just is there. And so this view really builds off of that. It's similar to the line of Aaron being chosen out of Israel and appointed, but yet it's Aaron's sin at the golden calf that brings ruin, near ruin on almost the whole people. David represents the whole people, and his individual sin brings ruin on all of the rest. David is not the biological ancestor of the whole tribe of Israel, but yet he is their priestly representative. And so this view essentially kind of fills out that portrait. That's the landscape as it currently exists. And again, this isn't a class about that, but we can't ignore that. I think each of these views are paying attention or highlighting certain things in the text, but having to underplay others. And, you know, let the civil conversation continue. But, you know, nothing for it. For me, what I want to make sure we don't sacrifice in the midst of our concern for what really happened or what is real is just how brilliant these authors are and what they're trying to communicate to us through these texts. I mean, my God, can you think of a more profound analysis of the moment that you know what is good and what is not good, and it's like a voice that's outside of you that comes and says, like, you know, you surely won't die. Who, you know what I'm saying? Like, someone's reading my mail. Whoever wrote the story knows me and knows you. And, you know, all of this stuff, it's, we can't lose that. That's the power. And that's the power that these stories have had and have charged the Jesus movement for millennia. And we can't, I don't know. And plus, I just think that's where the fun is, of like reading, how playful and creative all of this is. So this has been, from one angle, a very insufficient way to cover the views on historical Adam. I understand that, and that wasn't my aim, but I wanted to acknowledge it and really acknowledge what I think are the deeper issues, which is worldview, cultural divides. But the body of Christ transcends and has transcended all of those cultural divides. And there is a central confession about the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and the nature of the church, and we have a common story to tell. It seems to me that's at least where we should all be able to agree on. Just some brief reflections, if anyone, all of you, none of you, want to offer on the journey that we've had with Genesis 2 through 6.
Thank you. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, like I would say, it's okay to like wrestle with the text. You know what I mean? I think in the last couple months, I finally became content with like, I don't get this all the time. And like, I don't think I'm supposed to. And there's a dependency upon like the Spirit to help my understanding in this formation of me. But it doesn't dictate whether or not I'm a believer if I believe all of the right stuff. And it's okay to like ask questions and like think about it and have differing opinions, but as long as we're centralized on believing in the Father, Son, and Spirit as the church, like we're good to go. And thanks for wrestling with the text with us. Like, you said a couple of times, like, I don't even have this all put together. So, yeah, I just feel a freedom to wrestle with Yahweh.
I think that's been done before. Yeah.
I didn't expect how personal Genesis 1, 2, and 3 would be for me. So there's something to the idea of an origin in myself that I don't think I've connected before with my biblical study in the past. So that's still something I'm processing and gonna definitely take with me after this. But I did not expect it to be so specifically personal to me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah.
And I'm always still just amazed at how much one can draw from all these. I mean, I'm a very avid listener to the podcast, so I've like listened, and I was talking to John earlier about how much we keep going back to Genesis 2 and 3, and it's all there. And even still with that, it's amazing from talking that like we don't talk about a lot, but I still find things that I was like, wow, I've never looked at it this way. And some of the things about the conception and birth and like the grief and then the lament are just like, it just really changes the character, the feel of some of these kind of central parts of it. You just have to like sit with and like really like go through the rest of the story and like have that identity of who God is. So it's just that thing of that, like each time you have this opportunity to understand the character of God better through these stories in a way that can be really, I think, reassuring and transformative in terms of knowing who God is. And I think also as a father, understanding what does it mean to be a father, and what does it mean to be a parent, and what does it mean to think about the next generation. So it's just always really, yeah, really powerful how much you can just draw from this seemingly infinite well.
Jasmine, you want to go?
There's no pressure. There's no pressure.
Yeah, I think it's just like it has reminded me over and over and over that it's like reading, like just reading as it is great, and there's so much there, but just like the importance of understanding how much more is there when we learn from like people like you who have taken the time and like endless hours to like make all of these hyperlinks, and it just like exacerbates like the beauty and the perfection of God and God's story, and it like continues to stir in me like a desire to know more, like just from these like crazy 5 chapters.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, I'm just super grateful for this table of people and people who've, you know, poured their time into creating this format. Tim, thank you so much for being a voice of, I think, holy reason, you know, in all of this. And especially, I think that this will be a lot of the work that we did surrounding the first family, right, in the story. And in particular, Eve, I think, will be really healing and helpful for people, because people take the cues from the story and conduct their lives. They decide to treat their partners a certain way. They decide to parent a certain way. These are stories with deep, deep implications and deep, deep history. I really feel profoundly touched by all of this, and I also hope that those who engage in this class will be able to walk away and make better decisions at their own trees.
Yeah, deal. For all of you taking the class online, we hope this was as fun for you as it was for us. Yeah, thank you guys. From Adam to Noah, let's go forth and meditate day and night, shall we? Deal. Thanks.
Anybody have a guess of what view Tim Mackey you think favors? You think he favors 2? That could be. It could be. I think 4. I think it is 4, but you could be right, Wayne. It could be 2. Yeah. But I think, yeah, a lot of, from just looking back on some of the things, the way he approached some things and talked about things, particularly like Cain and when he went out of the garden and what happened, or when he left Adam and Eve, you know, I think that sort of, and he talked about it again here, I think that led me to believe that he favors 4, but like he said, it shouldn't be an issue, wherever you fall on that, it shouldn't be an issue that divides us, divides the church. And it's just a way for us to really discuss things and get at a deeper truth, more than anything. So I would not get caught up into which view, if you and your spouse have different, you approach it differently, y'all are in different categories there, I would not think that that's a big problem. Yes?
That's why I've always liked
Yeah, the more just scientifically and in every other way, archaeologically, historically, the more we learn, the more God's truth is revealed. So I think a couple of those comments they made, I thought, I didn't really catch it the first time I watched the video, but in preparing this second week, I went back and watched it again a couple of times, actually, and because I was really having a hard time understanding the difference between categories 3 and 4, what he was talking about. I think I finally understand the difference, but then I was listening to those students' comments there, and the first one who talked about, that what he learned, what he took from this study was it's okay not to understand everything. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to wrestle with it. That's all part of, the process, and to be humble about it, and to recognize that struggle, and be willing to come at it with a fresh approach. I thought that was a good point he made, and that's something I took away from this study, is that I do think when you approach, any passage in the Bible, but particularly when you're looking at the creation story, that is a good approach, is to be humble about it and to be willing to ask questions and wrestle with it and not get down on yourself and beat yourself up because you don't understand it perfectly and you have questions. I think that, and as long as that's motivating you to go deeper, I think that's perfectly fine. The other comment I thought was good was the one at the end there, the woman who said, she hoped that this study would kind of let people approach the family and the relationship between husband and wife and their partners, how they treat their partners, how they approach their partners, that looking at it in a fresh light might be helpful. And I do think that's true as well, because the creation story and Adam and Eve story has been used in the past, to justify a lot of, I don't know, just misogynistic or bad things, or abuse, domination, that are just not biblical, not godlike, it's not right. And it's all brought about by a misunderstanding and a mischaracterization of the story. So I think that was a good point as well, because that's important. Any other comments or anything? Y'all all know the story from Adam and Eve perfectly, right? Some of you may feel like you know less now than you did when you started. And you know what? That's probably a good thing. That's probably just means you're questioning things and thinking about things.
And we've heard the stories and stuff, and you've always wondered, where do all these people come from?
Yeah.
It makes more sense.
Yes. And like he said, the Bible doesn't hide that. I mean, it's right there. So, yeah, good things to think about. Well, all right. I think we can let y'all out 5 minutes early. Is that okay? Y'all be safe going home. Yeah.
Is it okay if I mention what we're going to be doing next?
Yes, that'd be good.
The elders decided that at least for the summer, we're going to be doing something that's, obviously mainly going to be Mark. There's 2 or 3 times he's going to be gone over the next 4 months that I'll preach. But we're going to just kind of take a deeper dive into what we learned on Sunday, what the sermon was about in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount. It'll be more of a discussion type setting than sitting like this. We'll have tables set up, people come around. There'll be some. Mark will have discussion questions and some things to emphasize in the sermon that doesn't necessarily have to be the whole discussion of the night, but can serve to lead the discussion. So that's what we're going to be doing, and hoping and praying that there'll be even more people here Wednesday nights to take part and just, hey, let's not just, hey, good sermon, bye, see y'all, have a good week, but hey, let's come back and revisit that something. Let's hear what Mark had to say. So anyway. Pray for my family.
When you come back, reveal with us the symbolic influences of the.
What the ears of Mickey represent. Mine, say whatever.
May your entire experience be a fast pass.
Single line, that'll do it.